So some of the things that we saw that you guys wrote down were things like, what if I get really sick? Or I'm afraid that one of my kids might die. Or what if something bad happens to me or to somebody close to me? Or I'm afraid of dying. Or what if I lose someone close to me? I'm afraid of suffering. This was something that we saw from each and every one of you. This was number 2 on that list of a fear. And so this morning we're going to talk about this fear of suffering and the fear of death. And you know, this is a universal fear because most of us live in reality. Our brains work, our minds work, and we look around us and we see people. We know people, especially the older that we get. We know people that get sick, and we know people that have died tragically, have died suddenly. We know people that have gotten sick with cancer or whatever and have suffered. So most of us are probably not delusional that eventually we are going to face death and we are going to face sickness or suffering. And so what do we do? How do we operate? How do we operate in this world knowing that at some point we're going to die, or at some point we're going to experience either suffering personally or with someone very close to us? So first, how does the world deal? How do we deal outside of Christ, outside of the gospel, outside of what we know from Scripture? How does the world deal with suffering and death? So if you were to just get on ChatGPT and say, I'm really afraid of suffering and dying, like what would the AI bot tell us? Or if you were to go to an atheist counselor and talk about your fear of suffering and death, what sort of stuff would you hear from them? Well, the first thing that you would hear is some general spirituality. So you wouldn't hear about Jesus, and you wouldn't hear about Jesus conquering death, and you wouldn't hear about the gospel and necessarily about heaven, but you would hear some vague talk about spirituality. And so some people deal with their fear of suffering and death by just deciding that there must be something, and they're not wrong, but there must be something beyond this. But they don't get specific about who God is and about what God has done for us, and specifically the gospel and what the gospel means for us when it comes to suffering and death. There's just a general vague notion that there's something beyond this that provides temporary comfort. I don't know what it is. I don't know if I'm going there. I don't know how you get there, but there must be something beyond this. And so that is somehow comforting. The other thing that you'll kind of hear or that you'll see in our culture is eat, drink, and be merry, right? Eat, drink, there's the Dave Matthews song, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So we don't know when we're going to die, and so in the meantime, let's have as much fun as we can. Life is short, and so let's grab life by the horns and have fun and try to have as many fun experiences, and don't think about all the negative stuff. Just be positive, and let's eat, drink, and be merry. So pleasure becomes the God, because I know there's suffering and death sometime in the future. So for now, and don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with being positive. There's nothing wrong with enjoying blessings from God. There's nothing wrong with enjoying good circumstances while they're going on. But a lot of people outside of Christ in them see pleasure, this idea of eating and drinking and being merry, as their ultimate goal. So in the meantime, I'm going to do what I want, when I want, to be happy and to stay comfortable. Another thing that people do is control. I'm going to try to control my circumstances. So either they're super cautious to avoid suffering and death, or maybe they're super into health and fitness in order to try to control the eventual outcome. And again, these things are good in and of themselves, but there's something more beyond that. Like, obviously it's good, right, to try to control some of those circumstances. We look both ways before we cross the street, right, because we fear being hit by a car. Or should we try to be healthy and try to exercise and have good discipline there so that we can have a healthier, more enjoyable life while we're still here? Of course. But outside of Christ, there's a control that we feel like we need to try to control all of those circumstances. And then another way would be distraction. And we all do this. We all distract ourselves. We distract ourselves with TV and with our phones, but also we just distract ourselves in general about death and suffering. And there's a certain amount of goodness there. I don't think we're supposed to walk around with, I might die today, being in the forefront of our minds, right? Or, oh, this might be the last day that I'm not suffering. So there's obviously some goodness in some of this. But outside of Christ, Christ has something to say to us. God has something to say to us beyond these kinds of ways in which we try to manage this fear. And then last is denial. So we distract ourselves, but sometimes, we're sick and we just don't go to the doctor because we don't want to know, right? Or somebody died close to us and we try to deny that it hurts, or we try to deny the fact that could be us one day. And so outside of Christ, there's all kinds of methods that we can use to try to control and distract and deny what is eventually going to happen, which is sickness and or death. So it's important as we face our fears, in order to turn our fears to transform those fears into faith, it's important to know and to ask the question, what does God have to say? What does God have to say to us about our fears? What does God have to say to us about our fear of death? And what does God have to say to us about our fear of suffering? Because in those moments when we're facing those fears, God has something to say to you, and there's something that's going to happen when God says it to you, and there's an opportunity for that fear to be transformed into faith. All right, so let's start off with death. So we're going to break this down. We're going to talk about death, and then we're going to talk about suffering. What does God have to say to us about fearing death? All right, in Hebrews 2, it says, since the children, that's us, have flesh and blood, since we're human, he, Jesus, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Okay? So the first thing that God has to say to us is, I know how you feel. I came down here and experienced humanity with you. Jesus came down here, and obviously, if we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he experienced suffering and he experienced death. And what is one of the reasons that he was willing to do that? One of the reasons he was willing to do that was to break that power of death. So the death for Jesus was only temporary, and because of that, death for us is also temporary. So this thing that we're afraid of, this earthly death, is only the beginning of your life with God. So we're here for however long, 15, 20, 30, 50, 60, 80 years, right? But because of what Jesus did, because he was willing to suffer and die, our death is only the beginning of an eternity being with Jesus, and an eternity walking in the cool of the day in the garden with God. What Jesus did on the cross restores what was lost in the garden by Adam. So Jesus, we see here in Hebrews, he's saying, I shared in your humanity. I know what it's like to be you. I know what it's like to die. So Christ that lives in you, the Spirit of Christ that lives in you, knows what it's like to suffer and knows what it's like to die. We see here Jesus talking in John 11. Jesus said to her, so who's he talking to? So Lazarus was going to die. Lazarus had died, and then Jesus didn't get there in time, and so Lazarus went ahead and died, and so Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And then Jesus said to Lazarus' family, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? So Jesus is telling us right here, he knows what's going to happen to him. He knows the power that that's going to do. It's going to destroy the power of the enemy, destroy the power over death for us. And so Jesus says, whoever believes in me shall never die. Now, is Jesus saying that whoever believes in me shall never have a funeral here on earth and maybe be in a coffin or be cremated or buried? No. But Jesus is talking about eternity. So death for us here on earth is only the beginning of an eternity with God. So we see right here that Jesus is telling you, he's telling Lazarus' family, and he's telling us, here's what happens at the end. Because I came and died, here's what happens to you at the end. And I don't mean the end where you die and go into the ground. That's only the beginning. There is no end for you. Because Jesus' life is eternal, then your life is eternal as well. And so this can change our focus on our present circumstances. There's a hope beyond our health here on earth. There's a hope beyond our fear of death here on earth. You know, Aaron and I don't agree on movies. We just don't. I can't. So this movie, Sully, is the last. And some of you know how long ago this came out. This is the last movie that Aaron and I saw together. Definitely in the theater, and maybe even at home. And one of the reasons is that I love suspense, and I love war movies, and I love violence, and I love I love the chase, and all that kind of stuff. Like, the Hallmark movie, I can't do the Hallmark movie. But if somebody's going to be kidnapped or shot or destroyed, or there's a plane crash, I'm all in, right? And Aaron can't. Aaron does not like those kind of movies. She said, there's enough going on in reality, right? I don't need to add, which makes sense. I don't need to add to this, right? So this movie was advertised, and she wanted to go see it. And I'm like, okay, plane crash, I'm all in. So we went and we watched the movie. And after we watched the movie, I asked Aaron, I said, Aaron, this doesn't make any sense to me. How did you, and she enjoyed the movie, how did you enjoy this movie? All of these people were in this plane crash, and it looked like that they were going to die. And you know what Aaron said to me? She said, I already knew the story. I already knew the story. I already saw the story on the news, and I already knew that it ended well. I already knew that everyone survived. And so then when she was watching the movie, she had a different outlook on the circumstances. When the birds flew into the engine and the plane was going down, I knew the story too. I'm into it, And she could enjoy the ups and downs, the drama of the movie, because she already knew the ending. And she already knew at the end everyone lives, and she already knew that the ending was good. And that's exactly what Jesus is telling us in these verses. That's exactly what we see in the Scripture. You already know the ending, and you already know that you will never die, and you already know that the ending for you is good. Just like the movie Sully. But that doesn't mean that we enjoy, in our context, every analogy breaks down. It doesn't mean that therefore I'm preaching to you to enjoy your suffering, right? Because we know it all, we know it all works out in the end. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it gives us perspective on death. We shouldn't have a fear of death, but most of us have a fear of how are we going to get there? I don't want it to be long. I don't want to suffer. I don't want my kids to suffer. I don't want my wife or my husband to suffer. I don't want those close to us to suffer. So how do we deal with that question? So the next question for this morning is, if God is good and he loves us, which he does, he is good and he loves us, then why does he allow us to suffer? So when we go through suffering, That's the second layer that can torment us. So not only are we experiencing the physical or emotional pain of the suffering, but then we ask the question, why? God, well, first of all, we ask the question, God, are you doing this to me? And then secondly, why is it happening? And this is one of those big, deep questions, one of those base questions that most people, most atheists, and when they have a problem, people that have a problem with Christianity or a problem with God, they ask this question. You're telling me that God is good and that he loves me, but then I'm looking at the world and I'm seeing all this death and suffering, so therefore God cannot be good and God cannot be love, because if he was, he would do things differently. So, I have a quick answer. I've thought about this over the years, and one of the quick answers I have for this morning, because that's not what the whole sermon is about, but one of the answers I have come up with that I have seen in the scriptures as I've looked through it is God values something greater. God values something greater than good circumstances. What does God value greater than good circumstances? He values freedom and trust. Think about that for a minute. Go back to the Garden of Eden. Why did God create Adam and Eve with the freedom to choose? He created Adam and then he created Eve, and he told them, he said that they were good, and inherently in their creation, they were created with the freedom to make good choices or bad choices, and to face the consequences of good choices and bad choices. And we know what choice they made, and we're living in the consequences now. So did God value something greater than Adam and Eve staying in good circumstances? Yes. He valued their freedom. And what did he want from them? Beyond their obedience, beyond them not eating of that fruit, he wanted their trust. And it's the same for us now in 2025. God, we've been created with the freedom to choose. Other people have been created with the freedom to choose, and their bad choices have consequences on us. The bad choices that we make, that our family makes, that our country makes, that the world makes, has consequences beyond. Nobody lives in a vacuum. We're all in this together. So other people's choices, including Adam's choice a long, long time ago, has an effect on us. And the reason it's that way is because God values something beyond just your good circumstances. Because if he valued good circumstances more than freedom and trust, then he would not have given Adam and Eve, he would not have given us the freedom to choose. He would have created us so that we always make the right choice and therefore always stay in good circumstances. And he would not, if good circumstances was the most important thing, then think about the garden, right? He would have given Adam the ghost of, the Christmas Carol routine. Adam, let me show you the ghost of Christmas future. Let me show you what would happen if you ate of the fruit. But he didn't, right? All he said was, don't eat of that fruit, for in this day you will surely die. That was the limit to the explanation. And God wanted Adam to trust that God was telling the truth, and trust in God's goodness. And he created Adam with the freedom to choose poorly. And so here we are, thousands of years later, here we are, and God values something for you beyond just your good circumstances. He values your freedom. He wants you to have the freedom to choose to trust him. Does that make sense? So that's why he didn't fully disclose the consequences of eating the fruit. Think about the prodigal son. We're not going to go into the whole story, but what kind of father says yes to his kid when his 16-year-old kid comes to him and says, give me my inheritance now so that I can leave, right? That would be irresponsible parenting. And yet we see in the parable, one of the things that Jesus is communicating is freedom and trust are more important. The Father wanted the Son to be free to make a bad choice and be free to live in the love and trust of the Father. Not forced to, which is the freedom. And so we see all throughout the Scriptures, God values something beyond your good circumstances. So what does God have to say? What else does God have to say about suffering? Let's look at 2 Corinthians 12. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10 says, this is Paul talking, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. All right, so let's give a little context. So Paul is going around, he's planting churches. He ended up writing about 2/3 of the New Testament. He's getting all kinds of incredible revelations from the Lord. And it says, to keep me from being conceited, a thorn was given to me in the flesh. All right, now if you stop right there, you would think that God was giving Paul a thorn. That Paul was punishing, or that God was punishing Paul. But look at what it says. Look at where the thorn is. It's a messenger of Satan to harass me. And 3 times he pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Okay, so Paul is planting churches and writing the New Testament and writing these letters and converting people to Christianity, proclaiming the good news of the gospel of grace. And we don't know what this thorn in the flesh is, if it was some sort of physical ailment or some sort of broken relationship. We don't know if it was emotional or physical. But what we know is that it was a messenger of Satan, and God, and Paul is asking God. 3 times he pleaded with God, I don't want this. Take this away from me. What was God's answer? But he said to me, for my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So God's answer essentially was no. I'm not going to take, of course God has the power to take away this thorn, take away this suffering, but God said no. God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power will be made perfect in your weakness. So God wanted something for Paul beyond just good circumstances. So God knew that in Paul's weakness, in the midst of his suffering, that God's grace would be sufficient for him, and that God's power would be manifested in him, and that nobody would be under any illusion that what Paul was doing was under his own power, and that God would be glorified in the midst of this suffering. So then look at Paul's answer. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness. If my weakness is going to make your power manifest, then I will boast in my weakness. I will boast in my suffering, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, perspectives, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So here's Paul. So here's somebody who knew where they were going at the end. They knew what happened at the end. They didn't like what was going on in the meantime. They were suffering in the meantime. So of course they asked God to take it away. And God said, no, I've got something better for you than just taking this away. My power is going to be manifest in this weakness. And so Paul says, well, if that's the case, then bring it on. For that sake, then I am content with my circumstances. So of course he wanted it to go away, but then he got his answer from God, and so there was a different way for Paul to operate in the midst of his suffering. We see in Luke 22, Jesus knows he's about to go to the cross. He's about to be betrayed and about to be arrested, and he's in the garden, and he goes away to cry out to God. He knows the immeasurable suffering that he's going to take and the death that he's going to have on the cross. And he says to God, he says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. So here's Jesus saying, God, I'm not super excited about this suffering that's going to happen. Is there any other way we can do this outside of me going through this suffering? So could we infer that Jesus was scared here? He was fully human. There was immeasurable suffering coming in his future. So we could easily surmise that Jesus was scared and was asking God to remove this cup. But then look at the next breath. He says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So what does God have to say to us about our suffering? First, he says, I never promised you that you would avoid suffering. You know, there's all kinds of verses in the Old Testament about the protection of Israel, and if you do this, then you will win this battle, and if you do this, then you will stay in my favor, and if you do this, you will have good circumstances, and if you don't do this, then you will have bad circumstances. But on this side of the cross, with all of the punishment, the wages of sin is death, and it was Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. Even Jesus, who never sinned, experienced incredible suffering and rejection. Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, experienced being chased by wild animals, being almost stoned, being shipwrecked, having this thorn in his flesh. So God never promised you that you would avoid suffering. And one of the lies of the enemy is that if you do X, Y, and Z, then you will automatically avoid this suffering. Or if you haven't been healed, it's because you don't have enough faith. And so one of the lies of the enemy is, let's stack up some promises and get people to believe these promises that God never made to you, so that when they don't come true, it will taint your view of the character of God. God never promised you that you would avoid suffering. He said, I will be with you in the suffering. Number 2, I am not doing this to you. Hear me. God is saying, I am not doing this to you. I am with you in it. I am with you in the suffering. I'm not punching you in the face and then coming up to you and saying, oh, I'm so sorry you got punched in the face. God values freedom and trust. Adam sinned. We live in a fallen world. The world and the power of sin comes at us. With broken relationships, sin and death comes at us. But God is not giving you or your uncle or your grandma cancer. God is not doing that to you. He is with you in it. Next, God is saying, talk to me about it. We see Paul pleaded with God. Jesus prayed to God. Talk to God about it. Tell him that you hate it and ask him to take it away. Does God have the power to heal our sickness and our suffering? 100%. Could it be in his plan and in his sovereignty to do that? Does it happen? 100%. Is God telling you, is the scriptures telling you to enjoy your suffering? 0%. Are you supposed to ask God to take it away? 100%. Can you yell at God the Lieutenant Dan routine from Forrest Gump and stand up on the top of the ship pole and scream at the storm that you hate what's going on? 100%. God can take that. Our other pastor, Ralph, calls calls God the galactic trash man. He can take all of those thoughts that we have, all of those angry thoughts about our circumstances. God, I hate that this is going on with me. I hate that this is going on in my family or in my marriage, with my kid. Whatever it is, God can take all of that, and you can yell at him about it, and you can tell him that you hate it, and you can ask him to take it away, just like Jesus did and just like Paul did. And then finally, God is saying to us about our suffering and our death, there is always a purpose. Nothing happens in our lives that is, from a suffering standpoint, that is completely meaningless. God is saying, I will always redeem it. He works everything out for his glory and for your good. We just don't like the process of what it looks like to get there. But there is always a purpose, and he will always redeem it. James says it this way, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So God isn't doing stuff to you, but he's with you in it, and he's going to take those lemons and make lemonade and redeem it for your good and for his glory. And one of the ways that he does that is a testing or building up of your faith. Right? When the path is straight and smooth, we are less aware of what we need to hold on to. Right? It's when the path is narrow and crooked and rocky that's when we bust out the walking stick, or that's when we hold on to the rope. And the reality is that none of us are in control of our circumstances. None of us are in control of this world. And so we need to hold on to our faith in God even when things are going well. But when things aren't going well, there's a reminder of what it is that we need to hold on to. When the sea is smooth, we tend to forget where we are anchored. But when the storms come, that's where we want to know what's going to keep this ship together, what's going to be an anchor for our souls. We ask those questions in the midst of the storm. All right, finally this morning, this is the second mention for Aaron. So Aaron likes flowers. So she likes to plant flowers. So coming up here in a couple of weeks, the seeds are going to come in the mail, and so she's going to plant the seeds in the little pots on the ping pong table down in the basement and put the grow lights on it. And she's going to prepare those little seeds are going to sprout into these little sprouts, and at some point, those little sprouts are going to have to go outside into the flower garden so that the sun can get them to grow up big and strong and beautiful. But in the meantime, they have to be on our ping pong table with the grow lights on it, and after a couple of weeks, she takes this fan, that's not the exact fan, but it looks exactly like that, off of our bedside table, and takes it downstairs and plugs it in and turns it on and blows wind onto those little seedlings, onto those little plants, those little sprouts. Now, why would she do that? Why did her farmer brother tell her to do that? It works out the plants. It's how you exercise the plants. So again, let's stick with the analogy. Plants have emotions and brains, right? So the plants are experiencing, right? So the plants are experiencing all of this wind. They're experiencing the storm. They're experiencing the bad circumstances. But what is happening to them simultaneously while they're experiencing the storm, while they're experiencing the wind? They're being strengthened for a future outside where they're going to grow tall in the sun and be beautiful. So they're experiencing this shaking, right? But that shaking is just what was described in James. That shaking is a testing of the faith that produces steadfastness. And when that steadfastness has its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. A faith that cannot be shaken is a result of being shaken. I would rather suffer with God than suffer without Him. All right, we're going to end with our anchor verse for this series, Philippians 4:4-8. It says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all, for the Lord is near." So what we see here is rejoicing in the Lord and in His ultimate plan gives us perspective on our present circumstances. We know how the movie ends. We don't know when it's going to end, but we know how the movie ends. We know that our death is temporary, and so it gives us perspective on our circumstances in the meantime. It goes on in Philippians, it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, including your fear of suffering and death, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. So talk to God about your fears of suffering and death. Tell Him that you don't like your suffering. Tell Him what you don't like. Ask Him for healing and ask Him to remind you of the hope that we have in Him. And then in verse 7, and then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. We are not going to be protected against bad circumstances and suffering. We are not promised peace out there. We will often not understand why we are suffering. However, we are promised a peace, not out there, but in here, that transcends the chaos out there. We have a place to go in our hearts and our minds where Christ is, that points to a hope and a better future. Therefore, we do not lose heart, 2 Corinthians. Therefore, we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away. Yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Let's pray.